it is my very huge pleasure to introduce a dear colleague, Dr. Joyce Dorado. She is the director and co-founder of UCSF Hearts, which stands for Healthy Environments and Response to Trauma in Schools, an award-winning program that promotes school success by collaborating with school systems to create more trauma-informed, safe, supportive, and equitable school cultures and climates that foster resilience, wellness, and racial justice for everyone in the school community. Dr. Dorado is a clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UCSF Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital. She has served as an appointed member of the California State Supreme Court Justice's statewide steering committee for the Keeping Kids in School and Out of Courts initiative, and has been the lead trauma-informed systems curriculum developer for Trauma Transformed, a center that advances trauma-informed, healing-centered, and anti-racist system change through community and cross-system collaboration. She has worked with trauma-impacted children, youth, and families for over 30 years and has presented at numerous regional, national, and international conferences and events, and is a published author. Please join me in a warm welcome for Dr. Joyce Dorado. So glad you could join our series this year. And I will mute myself and you can take it away.
Thank you so much, Barbara, for that kind introduction. I'm going to share my slides now. Let's see here. All right. So I'm going to be talking about the program that I started along with Dr. Miriam Martinez back in 2008. And the overall tack that I'm going to take with this particular, I could talk about this stuff for days and days, and I have. But with the tack I'd like to take with this particular Grand Rounds is to just present my program as an example of the ways that we as mental health professionals can apply research and science to facilitating practice change and systems change with non-mental health professionals. So I'll talk a little bit about the program, and then I'll talk about a little bit about some of our program evaluation results at the end, and hopefully that can be helpful to those of you who are working in the community and in community organizations. Okay, so Barbara was kind enough already to state our mission, but I just want to call your attention to our website. So if this piques your interest in Hearts, we've got lots and lots online, and check out our website because it'll explain more about what we do and how we do it. So just a little bit of a frame here about how we are trying to apply research and science and the bodies of literature to this work. The kinds of things that we draw on in our program is all of the literature around the treatment of complex trauma in children and families, the neurophysiology of trauma and toxic stress. We draw a lot on interpersonal neurobiology. That's Dan Siegel's body of work that is so useful in this scenario. We draw on social psychology, positive psychology, specifically out of the Greater Good Science Center at UC Berkeley. We'll talk about that in a minute. Implementation science, because we really are trying to create systems change through this work. And really what I've tried to do is, these are all of these bodies of research and literature have very complex pieces of information. And I've tried to boil down that information to the protoplasm of what anyone needs to know in order to work with trauma impacted folks, and trying to make those concepts easy to understand and sticky, and really feel sticky as in they stick, and feel very applicable to folks. In a way, what I learned early on is that we all, like those, I would imagine pretty much everybody on this call, we have what some might call the curse of knowledge. We know a lot about the fields that we work within, and we know a lot about mental health. And what can happen, this curse of knowledge it's a cognitive bias where we sort of overestimate other people's ability to understand us. Maybe we overestimate their sort of background knowledge, and so just a super useful thing that I read about was in a piece of research is, so I'm going to do a little experiment with you. I am going to clap a song that I have in my mind, and I want you to identify that song. If you if you get it, if you get the song, put it in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know. But I've got the song in my mind, and I'm going to start clapping it, and you just the rhythm, and see if you can identify it. Got it yet? Yeah, so obvious. Anybody got it? Okay. I'm assuming no, because so the song is America the Beautiful. Oh, beautiful for space. Like, for me, in my mind, it was so obvious that even as I was trying to pick a song, I was like, oh, that's gonna be too obvious. People are gonna get it. And that's a perfect illustration of the curse of knowledge. I hear the song in my mind. It is perfectly obvious what I'm trying to communicate, but I've left out key ingredients to this communication. For example, the actual tune, more context, whatever have you, right? So all of us in some ways have a curse of knowledge. And when we are trying to optimize uptake in learners, the big fix is vetting how we're teaching, what we're teaching, with the very learners that we're teaching to, right? And we're all educators here, we know that. And sometimes we forget that, especially when we're doing community trainings and such, right? Where we are speaking in a language that we feel so familiar with, but other folks are like, oh, not quite getting it. So that just was a very useful concept to me as we try to translate our knowledge to folks who don't have our expertise. So just a little bit about hearts and the structure of hearts. What you see before you is, you might recognize as a public health triangle. In the universe of education, they actually call this multi-tiered systems of support. And just like in the we have a public health approach to addressing trauma in schools and other organizations. But the sort of bottom of the triangle is those sort of universal supports of primary prevention. And in schools, what we're trying to do is we've moved from, well, I'll say more about this, but we are a whole school systems change approach, as opposed to using a school as a site to deliver mental health services only, right? And so as part of that, we really try to work with, integrate with already existing supports, initiatives, or whatever have you in a school. Like, for those of you who work in schools, you might know what positive behavior interventions and supports are, or restorative practices, or social emotional learning curricula. We're trying to bring basically a trauma lens, an understanding of how trauma can affect any of us as human beings, and then what any of us can do, regardless of our role in a school, to actually promote healing and wellness and resilience, as opposed to inadvertently harming. So that includes, how I deliver my, academic material as a teacher, or how I am implementing those positive behavioral interventions and supports that help all of the kids try to learn how to, pro-social behaviors. It also is about making sure we're attending to the wellness of everybody in the school and not only the students, right? It's in many ways what we're doing is a workforce development intervention, where we are trying to help build capacity for the adults, for the people who are serving the clients or the students, to be able to do their work better, to be able to do their work well while staying well in the process themselves. So that's the sort of universal supports. We also have sort of what might call secondary intervention or targeted supports, where we, for example, most schools that we work with anyway, have these coordinated care team meetings, where in these meetings, they're talking about students of concern, and they're talking about other sort of school-wide issues, maybe like the lunch hour is just completely out of control, and like, it feels like a really toxic kind of space, and how can they fix that? We also offer teacher wellness groups. So we try to, again, as consultants and as trainers, what we're doing is we are providing professional development training and consultation to try to help them, again, understand how trauma is affecting folks, and then what they can do to try to mitigate those effects. And then also we do, when there are resources, we provide more intensive or tertiary interventions, on-site psychotherapy with trauma impacted students. We also work, in schools, there's this thing called individual education, IEPs, individualized education plans, which are for students who are really struggling academically, and all of the tier 1 and tier 2 supports have not yet been enough to help them get on track. So we do that as well. So we have this whole school multi-system, multi-tiered system of supports with our schools that we work with. So a little bit about the history that, again, how did we get here? I'm trying to help you with the how done it, how did we get to this point? And so we launched in 2008. And what's interesting is that prior to 2008, we had gotten a pot of funding to do some on-site psychotherapy at a very trauma-impacted, under-resourced school in the southeast sector of the city. And we had this, the funding allowed us to have this beautiful therapy room with to put a postdoc there. And we really had some great services there. And what happened, as you might predict, is we would work with students, with young people. Maybe they'd have an episode of escalation, and we'd help them to learn coping skills and sort of how to regulate themselves and such. And maybe if they had an escalation, we'd bring them into the therapy room and help them calm down. But then almost the moment that they left, because the school itself was so trauma impacted, there's a lot of yelling and screaming in the hallways, a lot of noise, a lot of, just feeling of chaos. Students were almost immediately re-triggered. Yeah. And so what we realized was that we couldn't just go in and fix kids. I'm putting that in air quotes, which is only focus on individual kids. We actually had to change the caregiving environment, which is the school, so that it was no longer, so it was less and less a trauma-inducing environment. Yeah. So again, we did that. That's when we shifted over to Hearts. And we provide those sorts of services that I just mentioned. And then the evolution of this was, this was a 3-year grant back in the day. We figured maybe by year 3, we'll try to do more capacity building in the district. But because things were going so well in the 3 schools that we were serving and folks were seeing real results, the district actually invited us to do district-wide trainings with all of the school social workers and eventually all of the school nurses in the district. And at SFUSD, that there are school social workers at every school. So over time, we've actually had reach not only in the 13 schools that we've been in deeply over the past however many years it's been now, but also district-wide. The school social workers and the nurses all have much intensive training in the Hearts approach and, again, trauma and how we mitigate that. And so there's been a real reach here, and partly I think because we worked hard to be really good partners to SFUSD, to understand what their values were, what their goals were, right? And to integrate with what they were doing, as opposed to, mistakes that sometimes we make where we come in as the experts and we tell people how to do their jobs. And then I'm like, okay, that's great, but we have all these other things and we now don't necessarily feel like we don't know how you fit in. Yeah. So we have fit in, I think, really well. And then we also did a lot of work at Oakland Unified School District and beyond. I'm going to talk more about that at the end in terms of how we've expanded, but that's been the evolution of how done it. So we are principle driven. We have a set of principles that you see before you here. And these principles were developed, they were sort of co-developed as, there's a long story here, but I will just say that Department of Public Health heard about what we were doing. And we went and talked with the then Director of Public Health, Barbara Garcia, about what we were doing in the schools. And she said, wow, that's really great. We'd love to do something like that here at DPH, some sort of workforce development. It's kind of a thing like that, what you're doing. And the Trauma-Informed Systems Initiative out of DPH, the Department of Public Health, was born. And over the course of that sort of co-evolution, we had what we call values, what we called buckets, like sort of certain domains that we worked within that we drew down from our understanding of how to intervene and treat complex trauma. And at that time, then we did alongside DPH, we did a really thorough literature review and looked at all of the other trauma-informed systems initiatives that were happening across the country. And we came to these principles that I'm going to walk through here in a second. What I want you to call your attention to, so by the way, these principles are not only being used at Hearts, but they also have been used through the Trauma Informed Systems Initiative, and now across many counties and across lots of places. So the principles that I'm about to walk you through may even be familiar with you, because we did a whole series of a lot of training in DPH. We trained all of the DPH folks. We've been training UCSF folks in this, so this may feel familiar to you. But what I want to call your attention to is that these principles are not only applied towards the people we are serving at schools, at students, in Department of Public Health, its clients and patients, right? But also to how we treat one another as the adults, as the staff who are serving folks, how we work with caregivers and the adults of the students, how we think about our systems and our policies and practices, how we lead as leaders, that each of these principles, promoting each of these principles in all of those levels, ends up being extremely important if we're trying to make meaningful systems change. And that's what we also found with the Department of Public Health work that we're doing. All right. So what I'm planning to do here is to just briefly touch on each of these principles. Again, this is a multi-hour presentation, but I want you to get a sense, what I'm focusing in on here, on what are the sort of ways that give you an example of some of the concepts and ways that we've presented them that have been quite sticky and have felt very applicable to the folks that we're working with. Does that make sense? So for understanding trauma and stress, this is really about understanding, again, how trauma and chronic stress can affect us as individuals, our relationships and our organizations, and then thinking about how trauma can derail some of our best efforts, why that is, and then what we can do about it. One of the key ingredients, I would say, in the work that we've been doing around trauma is that I don't ever talk about trauma without also talking about resilience and healing and ways to overcome trauma. So just a little bit here, this probably feels familiar to you, but when something is going sideways, someone is behaving a certain kind of a way, in a challenging way, right, that's pushing a lot of my buttons, it's really easy to have this internal thought of like, what is wrong with you, right? And that brings up all sorts of like feelings of anger, frustration, maybe even fear, that then is going to affect how I react to that person, yes, which then affects that person, maybe escalates the situation, makes it worse, right? And so a big shift in perspective that the whole trauma-informed approaches movement has pushed for, which it has advocated for, is instead of, when that's happening, what is wrong with you, can we go with what has happened to you, right? Is there something that this person is up against that maybe I'm not aware of in this moment that is driving them to do this very unskillful and somewhat, whatever, very challenging behavior? And when I wonder about that, and that allows me this moment of grace of like, I'm going to take a breath and I'm going to not take this personally, right? That then allows us to maybe see the context within which this behavior is happening, which tends to foster a sense of connection and compassion as opposed to this adversarial, feeling. And then also helps us to see the strengths that people are bringing to bear despite what they're up against. And all of that helps us to have a much more helpful response as opposed to that sometimes quite punitive reaction that can happen instead. Yeah, this has been a really sticky concept for folks, and you see people using it all the time in the organizations that we work with. So this is really about the other sort of big piece of this is like understanding what's happening under the hood. So just riffing on a quote from Sandra Bloom, who developed the sanctuary model. You can look her up, but she talks about how understanding the neurophysiology of trauma and toxic stress can be quite liberating for us. I actually do see this quite honestly as a liberation movement, but can be quite liberating for us. Why? Because it helps us to understand those otherwise very puzzling behaviors that can happen in front of us and those big feelings that can otherwise overtake us. And with that understanding, it can shift how we respond. So I do talk about neurobiology with non-mental health, non-psychiatric folks. And with educators, for example, it can be really powerful because if you think about the job of educators, it's in some ways to like grow brains, right? It's to help us develop, right? And so when educators understand the neurophysiology, the neurobiology, the brain science, if you will, of stress and trauma, it actually then helps them think about, okay, then what do I need to adjust in order to keep growing brains, right? The other thing about, again, talking about, we all share the same underlying architecture. How that architecture is shaped is very different for each of us, depending on our experiences. But when I understand that I also have the same neurobiology as this other person, it really does help me not take what they're doing personally. And then instead I'm like, oh, that's the survival brain taking over, and then I can move from there. So just, some of the things that we share with folks is, imagine that you are familiar with Hebb's rule, or neurons that fire together wire together. But right, that's like where our bodies and brains are made up of a gazillion neural networks. And every time I do say think something, these neural networks fire together, and the more neurons fire together, the more they fire together more strongly. It's why what I do over and over again becomes more automatic. It's how we develop habits. It's why when I talk to teachers, I talk about it's why we practice our times tables. So then that's very automatic, and we can do more complicated things. That people really get that's how we learn. And then the difficulty is that when we are experiencing chronic trauma and our bodies go into that natural thing that happens when we're in danger of like fight, flight, or freeze, right? That big survival fear response. And that's what's happening over and over in our brains. In a way, trauma, like super simplistically, wears a groove in our brain, right? That we're much more easily knocked into with those automatic responses, even when there isn't an actual threat. Right? Even if it's just a trauma reminder. And the record player and wearing a groove in a record when you're playing a song over and over and over again works really well for folks of my generation and older. I have found that it has worked less well for younger people who don't have that experience of like, oh, if I accidentally knock this record player, the record player, the needle goes, and it lands in that deep groove, and then it skips, If you haven't had that visceral experience, all right, then I try to offer other metaphors like a rut in the road, right? That one is more easily knocked into, and then it's hard to get out of, once you're in it. If you're spinning your wheels in that same place, it's much harder to get out of that rut. And so those sorts of metaphors are really helpful, and to both, and also to help people understand, like, those neurophysiological processes are normal and natural and useful. It's just that when we get stuck in the trauma groove, right, then that becomes difficult. The other big metaphor that I think has been really helpful is that of a rider and a horse. And I actually first heard this from Bessel van der Kolk back in the day, and he heard it from somebody else. But if you think about the way that our brains work, our thinking brain, which is the way I talk about it, right behind our forehead, that's the frontal lobe, the prefrontal cortex. That's kind of like the rider in our sort of brain body system, right? And when you think about a rider on a horse, the rider can see, can take perspective, can like organize, plan. Oh, I'm riding and I see something interesting over there, but I know I've got to get over here so I can turn my attention, right? That's the rider in this scenario. The horse is the lower parts of the brain, the limbic system and all of that, the parts of our brain that are in charge of strong emotions and survival. And that's the horse acts on instinct, right? Out of it acts very quickly in a decontextualized way. And we need our survival brain, right, in order to function. And when the horse and the rider in this metaphor are working together, well integrated, if you think about it, you can get a lot of work done, get really far on a horse. We need all those parts of the system. But what can happen when we're either actually in danger or are reminded by the traumatic situation is that the rider falls off the horse, right? That the frontal lobe largely goes offline, and the survival brain takes over. And if you think about it in this way, if there's a horse in front of you who's terrified and who's just bucked the rider, maybe you, and you go up to that horse and say, "No, what are you doing? Stop it!" And you get close, and you're going to get kicked, right? So what we need to do as people who serve people is understand that sort of behavior is possibly rider off the horse behavior. And in that moment, if you're an educator, the sort of normal teaching bag of tricks, rewards and consequences, lectures, reflection sheets, whatever that have you, if you try to apply that in that moment, it actually can make things worse, right? It can escalate the situation even further. And so then what we need to do is recognize rider off the horse behavior and treat that as a fear response, not an anger response or a rude response, and help that person feel a little safer, a little more in control. Do all those things. I'm lowering the tone of my voice. I'm moving more slowly. These are the things that we do instinctively when we recognize that somebody or something, a being, is afraid, right? And then the other piece of this is that the instead of what is wrong with you and what has happened to you, and this rider off the horse concept doesn't only apply to the people that we work with, right? To the clients or the students, it also applies to us. Our riders can fall off of our horses too, right? When we're super stressed and getting reminded of trauma, think about the whole pandemic. I mean, we're like, right, there's a lot we are carrying. And the thing to know that we talk with educators about, and everybody that we talk about, is that the more power I have in a relationship or in an organization, the more my rider off the horse behavior can cause harm to others. And so I've got to work really hard on noticing when my rider's falling off my horse, and then doing what I need to do to get my rider back on my horse. And that might well include asking for help and saying, using that language of, my rider's falling off my horse, can somebody help me here, right? And if we've normalized that as a thing, as a thing that happens to people, as opposed to a deficit, then that becomes a way to try to create a situation in which we can take better care of one another and of the folks that we are charged with providing service to. Does that make sense? Okay. So the other piece that we really lean heavily into is really addressing burnout and secondary traumatic stress for the folks who are serving, right? The educators, the folks who work in DPH and other organizations. Because the fact is that when we work with trauma impacted folks day in and day out, there is a ripple effect, right? We can actually then start to experience secondary traumatic stress. And those of us in the mental health universe are lucky because we know about that. And that's why we have things like supervision and consultation, and we don't do this work in isolation. Folks in other professions don't learn about that. Teachers don't learn about this in teacher school. And so bringing that to folks' attention and helping them know that if you are starting to experience some symptoms of secondary traumatic stress, that's an injury, if you will, that it's important for you to get some healing around, right? Because I heard from some very wise folks who have been through a lot themselves, this quote that if we do not transform our own trauma, we are bound to transmit it. If we are experiencing that and we're not doing something about it, we are bound to cause harm. And so knowing that and really naming that for folks ends up being extremely important in this work. So I've talked a lot about sort of individuals here, but we also really try to talk about the things on the systems level. And so what you see before you is an org chart, and you don't need to see everything that's on this org chart, but if this is an organization where there is some structure and you kind of know where you're supposed to go to for what and what your role is and all of that. And what happens in organizations that are overstressed and under-resourced is there's actually a gravitational pull towards disorganization, right? Because trauma fragments. It can fragment our brains and bodies, it can fragment our relationships, it can fragment our organizations. And so what you might see in trauma impacted organizations is a lack of cohesion in how people are working with each other. There's sort of decontextualized decision making, where decisions are made without actually consulting the folks that the decisions are affecting, where there's a fear-based decision making. And sometimes you can see things like a crackdown on sort of order and rules, and you better stay inside this box and pay attention to this policy, you're in really big trouble. And the problem with that sort of very rigid way of being, while it may create some safety on some level, it is at the expense of relationship. It is at the expense of being able to be innovative and to grow and to learn from mistakes and to think outside the box, if you will, which as educators, that's part of our job as educators, is to help other people think outside the box, right? And so people really relate to this image even. And folks, you get a lot of folks going, oh, that's what's happening here, right? And that sort of thing of like, instead of what's wrong with you, what is happening to you, when I'm experiencing these things in my organization, instead of like going with what is wrong with these people, can I go with, what has happened to us? Is it possible, in fact, quite likely, that there is a lot of trauma that we are experiencing and we soldier on because there's so much work and we're so dedicated to the work and we try to pretend like it's not affecting us, but it is affecting us. And so then it becomes incumbent on organizations to address stress and secondary traumatic stress on an organizational level. It cannot only be about self-care. It must also be about organizational structures and procedures to care for the caregivers, yes? So I just talked a little bit about a trauma reactive organization, and the problem with these trauma reactive organizations is they are trauma inducing in and of themselves. We are trying to apply trauma-informed approaches which realize the widespread impact of trauma, including sociocultural trauma, which I'm going to talk about in a second, which recognize how that shows up at work and in schools, which responds by shifting our practices and resists re-traumatizing already trauma-impacted folks. But that's not even the end game here. In schools and in other organizations, we're trying to create safe, supportive, and yes, healing schools and organizations that instead of being fragmented are integrated, right? Where we take the time to reflect on the meaning of our work, or if something goes sideways, what happened, instead of just trying to sweep it under the rug and do all that risk mitigation stuff, right? Where people and relationships are at the center of the organization, not numbers, not money, right? Where we can be prevention oriented instead of simply reactive, where we can be flexible and adaptable, and where we can be equitable and inclusive, that the folks that we are serving, these communities are represented all throughout the hierarchy of our organizations, that this is part of being a healing organization that is trauma reducing instead of trauma inducing. And folks really have appreciated this image. I borrowed it from the SFDPH Trauma Informed Systems Initiative because it gives you the roadmap of where we're trying to go. Yeah. Okay. So let's just take a little wee breath here. This is another thing that I do a lot in my trainings is I try to build in brain breaks because, if you're super stressed out, it's really hard to think clearly. And so we're just going to take, I'm going to do this for myself too. You're going to take what we call a belly breath. First, you're going to blow all of the air out of your belly and chest right now. And then take a nice deep inhale through your nose. And then a long, slow exhale, longer than the inhale, like you're blowing through a straw. Empty your belly and your chest. And then one more inhale. And then a long, slow exhale. So many of you, probably all of you, are familiar with this technique, but what's happening, I like to explain the brain science behind it to folks because it might feel sort of omophobia to just like, let's just breathe. But actually that long, slow exhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system in our brains and bodies that helps us calm down when we're stressed out. And so we teach this to teachers, to educators, to other school staff. By the way, we work with not just teachers, we work with lunch ladies and administrators and front office staff, right? And they teach it to the kids too. And you can teach this to kids, even little kids. You can have them blow on a windmill, and like, okay, make this windmill go around as long as you can, right? And that we teach that to everybody because that's one of those in the pocket strategies. We try to offer in the pocket quick strategies that everybody can use. All right. So I've just touched on one of our foundational principles. I'm going to touch on cultural humility, which is our other foundational principle. And then I'm just going to very quickly, briefly touch on the others. And then we'll talk about program evaluation at the end. And we're going to leave some time for questions at the end. All right. So cultural humility and equity is another one of our foundational principles. For those of you who are not familiar with the term cultural humility, it's kind of the V2 of cultural competence. Instead of being like a competency that you reach and then you're done, it's a lifelong process of reflecting together as a community about the root causes of suffering, things like racism, sexism, homophobia, those sorts of things, And not only being aware of those things, but holding ourselves accountable as individuals and institutions to no longer perpetuate those harms. Days-long process, days-long training, lifelong process. I'm going to just touch on it here to sort of help you understand a little bit how we approach that with folks. So when I went to therapy school 2,000 years ago, these are the kinds of traumas that I learned about, right? All traumatic. And these traumas happen in a context. And these societal oppressions, unfortunately, are alive and well and living in America. And the true fact is that what we know now is that at things like racism, experiencing racism can bring up the same trauma response, the sort of rider off the horse, wear and tear on the body, those sorts of trauma responses as other forms of trauma. It's that looming and all too often quite in the face threat that one's safety, one's life is not as important as someone else's because of the lottery of birth, the color of my skin, who I love, where I was born. And so that is a trauma-inducing thing, right? And so we know that these sorts of, we call them sociocultural traumas, are embedded in the history of our country. We know that they exist in our structures. We call that structural racism, for example. We know that there's things that we do as individuals that are personally mediated and that even can be internalized. And so we try to address this on every level, because what we know is that if we only address those bullseye in the center circle traumas and not the rest of it, we're missing the boat, because there is a synergistic effect, right? A 1 + 1 = 10 effect of these different kinds of traumas that people experience. And so for us, if a policy, a procedure, practice is not, for example, racially just, it's not trauma informed. And so we embed this lens in everything we do. It's not extra, it's not parenthetical, it's embedded. And we also want to name that culture isn't just a liability. Actually, we want to lean into the strength of our people, right? And our ancestors. And I actually first heard this well articulated by Dr. Lisa Fortuna around this, but we really do also try to help people draw upon how they have overcome real huge adversities, and what can we learn from that? How can we apply it? That's cultural humility and equity. Safety and predictability. This is really about understanding that students can't upshift from survival brain into thinking learning brain if they don't feel safe, right? Because the rider's fallen off the horse, and if your frontal lobe isn't in there, you cannot learn. And that's true for all of us. So then it becomes absolutely fundamental to establish safety, and not just physical safety, but relational safety, which in many ways is the thing we have most control over. Sometimes we cannot control the physical safety situation, especially outside of the school, but having our students know that we care about them no matter what. And I might be really frustrated with you right now, but I still care about you, and we're going to solve this together. And having, really having each other's backs, and not just for our students, but in the adult community that is serving the clients and the students. Also, emotional safety is important, right? Because that dysregulated feeling can cause us to do some pretty unsafe things. So being able to manage stress and have skills around that is important in terms of creating safety. And also predictability. So how do we try to establish routines, because that feeling of like, what's going to happen next is so triggering for so many people, and especially trauma impacted folks. So creating routines, preparing for transitions, reducing unnecessary triggers in the environment, like those doors that always slam, when they say, or even the sort of overhead bell, is that a, or is that like a, and also, how do we make sure that we ourselves are not triggers? Like if I'm having kind of a hard day and I'm talking to a student or to somebody that I have power over, and I've got this face like this, I need to realize that that's potentially quite triggering to my student. And I need to be like, you know what? I just had this really irritating thing just happen over there. This face is not about you. Let's just both take a breath together. And I can, okay, that's a little bit better. How can I help you? Yeah. So really recognizing when we are triggers and making sure that we're not doing that. Well, that's a little bit about some of the most sticky concepts in the safety and predictability piece. And by the way, I hope you notice that these things are not only good for trauma impacted folks, They're also good for everybody. So that's the other really important component of Hearts, is that we try to make it clear we're not only trying to like help trauma impacted people, although the true fact is like so many of us now are trauma impacted, but these practices are good for everyone. Yeah. Okay. Compassion and dependability is the next principle. And, you know, really what's behind this is the understanding that like some of the worst traumas that we experience happen in relationship, right? Someone has betrayed us, someone has hurt us, someone has abandoned us, right? That's the bad news. The good news is we are actually hardwired for relationships to heal us. And this was where interpersonal neurobiology is such a rich place to draw from. What we know is that because we have all of these, like this interpersonal neurobiology, mirror neurons, the vagal nerve, the vagus system, other sort of structures in our bodies that connect us with one another naturally. Trauma can be kind of contagious. If someone is experiencing these things, like we try to help, and it can feel like we can start to feel with them, right? The good news is, so is love, so is kindness, contagious. And I'm just going to say it, trauma can be toxic. Love is the medicine. And we talk about love. We don't just talk about attachment. We talk about love, compassion, kindness, and how we're all hardwired to heal within those things. And so one example of that, that has been very sticky with folks, is that knowing that because we are bipedal, large-headed creatures, our babies are born in some ways oddly prematurely. Unlike, you know, a baby horse, they can't just get up and run. They're actually dependent upon us to help regulate their digestive systems, their sleep systems, certainly their stress arousal systems. And in fact, when you look at these pictures of babies, you might have a kind of feeling. That's us sort of naturally reacting to that. So think about how you feel now, and now how do you feel now? You see this is co-regulation, which again, most of you are familiar with, but this is a very sticky and important concept for working with folks that, like I talk about, like if somebody hands you a crying baby, you know, what do? You don't just hand it right back, right? You automatically almost start moving, you're using your breath, your body, your voice, you know, and calming the baby down. And what you're doing is you are loaning the baby your calm neurobiology, so that over time, because neurons that fire together wire together, that's how babies start to develop self-regulation skills, right? The ability to calm down after distress. And so people can really relate to that. And to know that we need co-regulation for our whole lives. It's not just babies that need it, right? There's some really great research that says that when we are totally dysregulated, our riders off our horses, co-regulation gets us to calm much faster than self-regulation. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps. We all need it. And here's the pitch. Co-regulation is actually part of your job. Why? Because if you're an educator and your student is like not getting it and they're starting to feel stupid, and maybe that's triggering for them, their rider's starting to fall off their horse, when we can co-regulate and say, I see you're frustrated here. I'm going to work beside you to help you. we're going to do this together. You're helping their body to calm down, their rider to get back on their horse, so that they can work on that mutual goal of learning with you and be those engaged learners that we're trying to help foster, right? And also, if you're the boss of people or supervisor of people, and that people are getting dysregulated and riders, we need to help be that calm, stable presence, right? That can help people get back into a place of regulation and work with us towards mutual goals. And if we are co-regulating super stressed out people all day, we need our own co-regulators too. So I always ask folks, who are your co-regulators at work, at home? How do you make sure you have really ready access to them? Because the true fact is, if I'm not self-regulated and I'm saying to somebody, calm down, that's not too helpful, right? So how do I also have my own co-regulation? Very powerful concept that lands very, very well with folks. Okay. Empowerment and collaboration, looking at the time, we're still okay. I got about 5 more minutes here. So empowerment and collaboration is really about understanding that part of what we know from research is that part of what makes trauma traumatic is that when something happens, we are helpless to escape this overwhelming stressor, right? And that is, and that is part of what makes trauma traumatic. So when we take away the voice and choice of folks and make them feel helpless, it actually can also be re-traumatizing, if you will, right? And so what we know from from being trauma healers ourselves is that part of what can promote healing is to be able to take action. What we know is when folks have been able to take action either during a trauma or after a trauma, we tend to heal more effectively. Yeah. And so applying this in schools, when we allow for folks to be able to take action about things that are harming them, and promote that and encourage that, whether that's in an actual protest or whether that's other ways to provide voice and choice to folks, and to be able to have them have a sense of agency around that, that actually contributes to healing. And also a sense of purpose. What we know from science around resilience is that when folks have a sense of purpose, it actually helps them be much more resilient in the face of adversity. And so these are volunteers during the COVID. These are folks who are trying to help other people, young people, and that gives them a sense of purpose that then helps them, heal from this collective trauma of the pandemic. And so we talk about that, and we talk about the importance of doing things with people, not to them or for them. And that when we create forums for people to have voice and choice around decisions that are meaningful to them, that actually can mitigate the effects of stress. There's a lot of science around that too, right? And if you think about schools are very hierarchical places, right? And so we're not saying, like, teachers get nervous and like, oh, you mean kids can just do whatever they want? That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is, where are the places where there can be an arena for voice and choice? And in our workplaces, well, again, what we know from the research around this is that when people in a workplace have a sense of agency, some voice and choice about these decisions, people are happier, healthier, and more productive. And so how do we encourage that? And how, when we have power in a system, how do we actively invite it and make sure, because it's very hard to speak truth to power, right? How do we make sure that we are inviting that voice and listening and responding to it with action that helps to mitigate some of the stressors that people are voicing? Does that make sense? Okay. Resilience and social emotional wellness is the final one that we're talking about here. When we talk about resilience, that's like being able to bounce back from adversity. And I think this lands very well with folks, that it's really about being able to face the often brutal reality of what is, but also maintaining a staunch optimism that we can overcome it. It's about not just what has happened to you, but what's gotten you through. And how do we lean on the strengths of people who have overcome and are, the fact is, if you're standing before me, you have gotten through some stuff. How did you do that? It's about highlighting even small steps of progress. And then I really try to contextualize resilience. There's a way that resilience can be weaponized if you think about it. It's like, you need to be resilient, right? You individually need to be resilient. If we are saying you need to be resilient and we are not addressing the larger context that maybe is quite toxic, then that actually can be sort of pathologizing, right? It's like, we actually also need to create learning, teaching, work, caregiving environments that promote resilience, as opposed to asking people to have grit and resilience without addressing the rest of it, right? A really great resource around this that lands very well with folks, and I want to offer to you if you don't know about it, is the Greater Good Science Center out of UC Berkeley. Their mission in life is to put out science-based wellness practices that can create more happiness, that anybody can use. This is just one of their posters, 6 Habits of Happiness Worth Cultivating. You can find it at the URL down here, and you will have a PDF of these slides available to you. So one of the ones that I love, this is my favorite one, is being kind, right? Being kind to others makes us feel good. Altruistic acts light up the same pleasure centers in the brain as food and sex. So if you're nodding off there, maybe I just got your attention. I'm talking, of course, about good food and good sex, right? This is like pleasure. But the point is that, like, it's a twofer, right? If I'm kind to somebody, that is not only good for them, but for us. How do we create cultures of kindness, right? Because it's good for everyone. And these proactive things that proactively build resilience then help us be more resilient organizations that can more easily deal with stressful situations. So So I like to offer that to folks. And I also like to talk about post-traumatic growth. So there's surviving trauma, there's being resilient and bouncing back from trauma, but there's also actually a thing that happens in post-traumatic growth when we are given the opportunity to heal and take better care of ourselves and one another. There is growth that happens. We come actually back on the other side of this healing process wiser, stronger, more capable, maybe even in some ways uniquely qualified to give back to the world in a certain kind of way. So I want to stress that, like, when we talk about trauma in organizations, we try to not have this what we call a deficit model, right, where we pathologize. Instead, we try to say, okay, people make adaptations to survive, and when we give them the opportunity to heal, like we need these folks. These are the folks who are going to help to change the world. We cannot give up. I've had people ask me, by high school, isn't it a little bit too late to intervene? And I'm like, no, of course not, right? So, all right, I'm trying to get to program evaluation. I'm going to touch on this briefly, and then I'll leave some time for questions. I do think we've been relatively successful. We were able to publish some of our program evaluation results in School Mental Health. The site is there. But when we work with folks in this way, this whole school way, we are seeing staff reporting increases in knowledge of trauma-informed practices, but not just knowledge, but actually use of these practices. They see their students as being more able to learn. They're observing that the kids are more engaged in class and sort of being sent out less for disciplinary reasons. We've also saw in a school that we were in for the longest and who kept really good records, we saw decreases in disciplinary office referrals, even after the first year, and lots after the fifth year, decreases in incidents of student aggression, and a big decrease in suspensions. That's when people are sent home for so that really huge, very promising results. And what as I've mentioned, we have fairly good uptake of these practices at the district, including an adoption of a safe and supportive schools policy that embeds trauma-informed practices in it, where we've worked with many, many school districts. We are now a member of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network through a big SAMHSA grant. We've launched a Heart Professional Learning Institute through some very generous funding from the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. So I think it seems to me that we're doing pretty well with this work. And as I've mentioned to you, this work is not only happening in schools, but has seeded work in the Department of Public Health and other institutions in San Francisco. DPH has also worked with juvenile probation and the court system and lots of other systems there, child welfare system. And that work actually seeded a 7-county trauma-informed systems center called Trauma Transformed, and they've also done work elsewhere in the country, Seattle and New York. So I do see this as a movement. Welcome to the movement. I want to thank all of you for everything you do to make the world a better place. I do see this as a change the world kind of work that we all do together. Thank you so much for your time. And I want to acknowledge all the folks that have helped with this, and I can now take questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dorado. That was fantastic, very comprehensive review. And I want to open it up for questions. I do have one question about terminology and how you integrate all the various terms that we've been using particularly in academia. So we have trauma-informed systems, we have intersectionality, we have social determinants of health, we have social justice. And I'm wondering if you could, we're as academics, right? We're continuously using these terms and potentially using them interchangeably. And I'm wondering if you have something to say about that, how we can be more precise and also experience near and more reachable and accessible, and talk in a way that is understandable to people who are not academics, who don't talk in this weird, funny way that we do.
Right. That's a great question. Thank you. And there's lots of ways to do that. But one of the things that I found to be most effective is to try to start with, how are you doing? Like, how is trauma and stress affecting you? What are the ways that structural racism have impacted have impacted you? What are the ways that that we notice that in people, with people that we love? And in some, like, back when I used to do more one-off trainings in schools, which I really don't do anymore, but if they asked me to come in and do a training about trauma, I would come in and to talk about the trauma that educators experience and how are you doing, and then do some of these like interventions, exercises, whatever have you, with them. And then they felt better and they were like, oh, I wonder if this could work with my students. So, and I think that frankly, that's also like how we address structural racism. We can't just like talk about the things that happen over there. We talk about what's happening with us, right? And how that is affecting our relationships. And so I think that's a good place to start, with that personal experience and the felt experience. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And to your point about the interpersonal impact, and that this happens in the context, and how interpersonal relationships are also healing. So I really appreciate your response. Thank you for that.
Sure.
Other questions? I'm looking at the chat, trying to multitask here.
Sure, no problem.
I'm going to be old fashioned and raise my hand.
Oh, go right ahead, Liz.
And I know we only have a couple minutes, and this is not a couple minute question, but kind of conceptually and in terms of like operationalizing, what do you think the difference is between trauma and stress? Like, do you use the terms interchangeably?
Yeah.
Like I still feel like I don't really understand how trauma is different from stress.
Yeah. That's a great question. It actually highlights a few things. We, those of us in this field, know that there is a difference between trauma and stress, but I actually use words like overwhelming stress, extreme stress, when I'm doing community trainings, because sometimes the word trauma can feel quite off-putting and can make people feel like, oh, that's about them, not about me.
Right. It's a particular thing that happened to them and didn't happen to me. Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so I do sort of use the words interchangeably, but I try to, what I didn't do in this talk is I do actually define trauma very clearly. As when we're faced with an overwhelming stressor that we're helpless to do anything about, and the ways that it affects our brains and bodies.
Okay, so overwhelming and helpless are the two.
Overwhelming and helpless, and causes us to be dysregulated, sometimes chronically, which then has wear and tear on our bodies and brains, right?
Okay.
Toxic stress actually is a term that is used actually quite interchangeably with trauma. It's that, like, anyway, so I could talk about this for quite a long time, but I'll say that there is healthy stress. I talk about healthy stress, right? If it's just like challenging to us, then that helps us grow. But if it's overwhelming, that becomes toxic and traumatizing.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, but again, there's that curse of knowledge. If I try to explain all those nitty gritties, like, people just glaze over. I just try to use language that feels
more
familiar.
accessible. Yeah, simpler.
Tiffany, you just put something in the chat. You can feel free to unmute yourself if you're still available to do so. Oh, no mic. Okay, I'll do it for. So how have schools performed with regard to adherence of HEART program principles, knowing some of the techniques are really different from traditional schooling approaches?
Right. So it depends. So when we can be there for systems change occurs over years. It cannot be just a one-year process. So when we are able to be with them for long enough, what ends up happening is this trauma-informed approach doesn't just become like the HEARTS program, it becomes the way we do things here, right? It becomes the way we do things here. And we really have seen that sort of transformation. But the active ingredients in how that happens is time and also support. What we've found is that this works a whole lot better at SFUSD than maybe it might work elsewhere, because it's kind of in the water at the district. So it's also supported not only by the schools, but by the district themselves and by the bosses of the principals. Like, they understand what this is about. And so it helps to keep it going, even when, for example, the principal leaves or there's turnover in a school, right? The churn is definitely a big challenge. And so we're still dealing with that. But when it becomes sort of like so familiar to folks that it's the way we do things here, that's when we know that things have gone well. And that does happen. That has happened. And in other places, when there's been enough turnover and we were only there for a short time, you kind of do see a little bit of what happens in systems, it sort of kind of goes back to its old ways. And then we got to kind of go back and try to retool.
I have so many more questions, and we're out of time. It's 1 o'clock, and this is amazing. Thank you, Joyce. I'll be pinging you later to get more insights from you,
Of course, it's my
especially
pleasure.
as it relates to curriculum building at our multicultural clinical training program. So stay tuned.
Great.
Thank you, everyone,
Thank
for
you.
being here today. This was a lovely time together. So appreciate your time, Dr. Dorado, and everyone else's. Take good care.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Take good care. Bye-bye. Be well.